who were trying to protect their wealth from the masses. The field was still hazy to most Americans, including those congressional officials now peering down at Lee. "Your business is what?" asked John McCormack, a Democrat who chaired the committee Lee sat in front of, known as the House Un-American Activities Committee. Lee looked back at him. "It is very difficult to describe, Mr. Chairman," he replied. "Some people call it publicity agent. Some people call it counsel in public relations, but that would give you a general idea of it." Even Lee may not have known what he'd launched. But others noticed. This new industry, this new field of public relations as it was eventually described, had brought Lee clients from across the country. There were the giants of the Gilded Age who'd turned to Lee to help bury controversies, people like the Rockefellers who relied on Lee to help cover up some of the worst massacres in American history. There were the copper and steel and banking magnates turning to Lee to thwart any kind of regulatory oversight. There were the plutocrats of the railroad industry who still maintained a stranglehold on American transit, depending on Lee to retain their monopolies. And there were the politicians of the era, deep in the pockets of these American oligarchs, relying on Lee's assistance in blocking the progressive forces rising around the nation. But they weren't the only ones. As Lee found success after success in America, international clients came calling from across the political spectrum. The forces of fascism gaining ground in Italy welcomed Lee with open arms. Rising totalitarians in Moscow were likewise eager to see what kind of opportunities Lee might be able to unlock. And there, in Germany, was a client who recruited Lee in the early 1930s, a company named IG Farben, which was concerned, as Lee told American officials on that day in 1934, with how Germany was perceived in the United States, and how Lee might be able to improve things. The higher-ups at IG Farben knew Lee's talents. They'd read about his connections and his cant, his willingness to open doors for and whitewash whichever clients were willing to pay the most for his services. As Lee revealed to congressional investigators, IG Farben was happy to pay for Lee's work, for some of these public relations services they'd heard so much about, if only he'd make it easier for Germany to improve its image in the United States and expand the efforts and success of a new dictatorship building in Berlin. The directors of the company told me they were very much concerned over the German relationships with the United States and antagonism toward Germany in the United States, Lee admitted during the hearing. They wanted advice as to how those relations could be improved, so they made an arrangement with me to give them such advice. And that, to Lee, was all it was, an honest arrangement based on honest advice. He'd broken no laws. He'd committed no crimes, and he was happy to take payment, the equivalent of more than $500,000, adjusting for inflation, for just such assistance. Lee claimed that the guidance he offered was only to IG Farben, not that such advice was especially controversial anyway. He told his German counterparts that if they wanted the regime in Berlin, which Lee preferred to refer to as the German government rather than the Nazis, to succeed, they should avoid blatantly obvious propaganda. Our people regard it as meddling with American affairs, and it was bad business, Lee claimed. When McCormack asked if Lee would ever consider acting as a mouthpiece for propaganda, Lee stiffened, saying that he'd taken the position long ago that I would not disseminate anything, any propaganda, however innocuous. Instead, Lee advised that the Nazis should establish closer relationships with American press correspondents located in Germany and try to get those journalists to disseminate Nazi messaging. That, Lee told his German partners, was key, finding trusted mouthpieces and middlemen who could blast Nazi messaging far and wide, all for the sake of improving relations between the United States and Germany. But as the questions continued, Lee revealed that it wasn't just advice he had provided. He admitted that he'd also charged one of his employees to monitor American media for what they are saying about Germany. Lee would then relay the themes, as well as his thoughts, to his German contacts. All the better for German counterparts to craft their messages for American audiences, and for American audiences to understand that this new regime in Berlin was one worth supporting. The hearing never grew heated, never grew especially raucous. As Lee cooed at one point, "My dear sir, I am perfectly delighted to cooperate." His polished demeanor, though, belied a tension Lee had never known, a tension suddenly bubbling to the surface, breaking around Washington, spilling across Europe.